Well, did I tell you there was going to be two parts of this week's lecture? There's actually going to be three because I stopped part one prematurely. I had had this slide on the end originally of part one, and I moved it up just because the context of the lecture, it made more sense to be where it was supposed to be. But I forgot I had done that when I got to the end of my little lecture. So we haven't yet covered conflict perspective and about deviance, but also there's another slide on the functionalist perspective that I wanted to touch on. Actually, a couple slides, and this is about strain again. The role strain that Merton, I think it was, had talked about, and the functionalist perspective says that there are different ways to respond to strain, and the five different ways include conformity, which is the most common response, and it's the one that most of us, given the fact that you're sitting in this classroom, suggests that if you didn't originally do it, you are now at least adopting the notion of conformity, which is the non-deviant response to strain. So you're pursuing a college education, and this is just one example of this, but this is typically the way. Some people go out and they just work really hard and, get associated with persons who, have important roles in society and everything like that, and advance themselves that way. But whatever the way is, this is the socially acceptable one, where you accept the goals of society, and you accept the means to get there. With innovation, this is an individual who wants to achieve a cultural goal but uses illegitimate methods to get there, and crack dealers and drug dealers and things. An example of that. I suppose meth would be the thing we should have on the slide to be kind of more current these days. There's this excellent television show in the early 2010s era called Breaking Bad, which involves a high school chemistry teacher who discovers, because of various things in his life, that he needs to find other means to make more money because he's not making enough money having led a life of conformity, and moves to the innovation method of making more conformity, becomes a meth producer. And it's a dark series of stories, but it's a very interesting show, and it really does display this concept of innovation very well. Ritualism, the individual has given up on attaining cultural goals but still clings to conventional methods of conduct, even though, and this is what we call the sort of the burnout in society, and you hear about the old burned out hippies and these kinds of things. These are people who really just have given up on trying to succeed or do anything more with their lives, but still are conforming to the expectations of society within that context. Retreatism, where an individual rejects the goals of society and also rejects the means to attain those goals. And really kind of an interesting collection of possibilities here. Of course, the alcoholic and the drug addict is one example of this. Individuals going to a convent is another example of this, where they're really kind of leaving society, leaving culture, and just moving into another lifestyle that has nothing to do with cultural goals. And finally, rebellion, which is where cultural goals are rejected, and there's an effort to replace them with one's own goals. And these are the revolutionaries that are in society from time to time. So this is an interesting table from the text based on Merton's 1968 work that shows how each of these methods or modes of adaptation to role strain, how they compare to each other in terms of whether they accept or reject cultural goals and the institutional means to access those goals. So if this is of interest to you, I'd encourage you to come back and take a look at this. This is a pretty good table, actually. Now we're going to move into conflict perspective on deviance, and there'll be a few slides, and then this short addendum to part one will be finished. Most street crime, according to those individuals who have the conflict perspective, is caused by the marginal working class. That is those who threaten the social order. This is the people who are in and out of jobs, and they're not even really worried about the people who are unemployed chronically, but really looking at the people who get a job and lose a job, and or maybe working but only working part-time and not really able to succeed financially because of the limitations of the money they're earning or the position they hold. This is the group that the conflict perspective believes is the one that commits most of the street crime, and so we as a society then punish those individuals and punish that behavior when it occurs because we feel most threatened by them. And it is the law that, of course, is used by society to what conflict individuals would say was to oppress these individuals. Those who have wealth and power have a tendency sometimes to bypass the law, and an example again of the white collar crime we were talking about earlier. Others have to pay full penalties. An example, and I'm not sure if it's in this text or if in another book that I have worked out of, but they talk about the difference in penalties between cocaine and crack cocaine, and cocaine being the drug of that was associated with higher socioeconomic groups, and crack being the lower socioeconomic replacement for that. And despite the fact that cocaine in many ways has more serious consequences to the individual and things like this, the punishment for being caught with or using cocaine, the prison sentences that have been meted out and everything have been a good deal less serious than those meted out for crack cocaine. And of course, crack cocaine is associated with the lower socioeconomic and minorities much more than cocaine. And so you can kind of see there the implication the conflict people would say is this is our way of keeping the lower socioeconomic classes under control, even among drug users. Now, there are times when somebody from the upper social classes are showcased, so it appears as though it's fair. What is it, around 2009, 2010, Bernie Madoff was an investments counselor, I believe, in New York City, who was arrested for fraudulently using what was called a Ponzi scheme, taking people's money and investing them in things that didn't really exist and using the money to invest more money and those kinds of things. People lost millions of dollars with that, and I suspect some famous people lost millions of dollars with that, and that is probably why he got arrested. But there was a big deal about that, and it was in the news, and he was sentenced to what amounted to probably 3 lifetimes in prison and this kind of thing. So this is what conflict theorists would tell you. This is really for show, just to reassure us that white collar crime is being dealt with as well. And yet, again, you look at all the stuff that's happened on Wall Street, and most of those bankers have walked away from that without any penalty at all. So that's a conflict theorist would say that, of course, this is what happens. And conflict people would actually be very much behind and in support of the Occupy movements. You read an article, and it was referenced in this chapter about the Saints and the Roughnecks. And just a moment to reflect and tie this back into that article. How did the social class of the boys' families determine how they were treated by law enforcement and by school authorities? And it just raises the question if you've ever been unfairly treated due to your social characteristics, whatever that might be, class, sex, religion, economics, race, whatever it might be. Conflict people say if there were no laws and no norms, there would be no deviance and no crime. They're trying to tell you basically that these things exist because we say they do. The people who influence the legislation and not even necessarily the legislators themselves. Of course, our legislators in Congress, our representatives and senators, tend to be fairly elite. You can't really get into those positions very well without having a lot of money. And if you don't have a lot of money yourself, you have somebody who has a lot of money financing your campaign. And so those individuals who go to Congress tend to be associated, of course, most closely with the conformity and also with the upper socioeconomic levels. They're either in them themselves or they have some obligations to individuals in those levels. And so the persons of higher socioeconomic status then are the ones that are really influencing the kinds of laws that are developed. And they're the ones who define what is permissible in our society, and in any society for that matter. So those individuals then have the authority to extend criminal status to those who have conflicting norms and interests, or not, if they choose not to. So you see that gives the socioeconomic, the upper classes, much more power than the lower socioeconomic groups. And conflict people will tell you, of course, that those in power will continue to use their power to preserve it. So one can bet that the legislation is going to be something that will lift up the individuals in the upper classes, and that will ignore or perhaps oppress those individuals in lower socioeconomic classes.